At 27, Clara Bennett was broke, alone, and down to her last few dollars. When she bought an abandoned telegraph station for just $75, everyone in town laughed and called it the worst mistake of her life. But 3 weeks later, while prying open a locked room behind the old operator's desk, Clara found something hidden in the wall, something tied to a Civil War secret that had been buried for more than 150 years. And when she opened it, she realized this ruined station had been waiting for her all along. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? I hope you're having a peaceful day. And if you enjoy emotional mystery stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. At 27, Clara Bennett had become an expert at pretending everything was fine. She smiled through overdue notices, ignored collection calls, and refreshed her email every morning hoping for freelance work that never came. 3 months earlier, she had believed her small graphic design business would finally take off. Instead, 2 major clients canceled within the same week. A software subscription she couldn't afford renewed automatically, and a broken laptop repair emptied what little savings she had left. Now, after paying for one final week at a cheap roadside motel, she counted the money in her wallet for the 5th time that morning. $81. That was everything standing between her and sleeping in her aging hatchback. She folded the bills carefully as if treating them gently might somehow make them multiply. The motel manager knocked softly before opening the office door. "Checking out today?" he asked with an apologetic smile. Clara nodded. "I'm afraid so. Wish I had better news." "Me too." She loaded the last of her belongings into the car, 2 duffel bags, a cardboard box filled with family photographs, and a toolbox inherited from her late grandfather. The engine started reluctantly before settling into an uneven rumble. She had nowhere to go except wherever the road and the remaining gas would take her. Around noon, she stopped at a small diner outside the quiet town of Ashgrove, ordering only coffee to stretch both her budget and her time. An elderly couple at the next booth chatted about a county tax auction taking place that afternoon. "Mostly junk this year," the man said. "Old sheds, empty lots. That abandoned telegraph station finally made the list." "Nobody wants that place," his wife replied. Clara wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the words caught her attention. Telegraph station. Curious, she picked up the free community newspaper lying near the register. A small advertisement listed the auction properties. Most required deposits she couldn't imagine paying. Near the bottom sat a single line. Property number 18, abandoned telegraph station. Minimum bid $75. An old black and white photograph showed a weathered wooden building with boarded windows and a leaning porch. It looked forgotten. She should have laughed at the idea. Instead, she kept staring at it. She remembered visiting abandoned railway museums with her grandfather when she was little. He loved old machines because every one of them had carried someone's story. "Buildings remember," he often said. "People just stop listening." Before she could talk herself out of it, Clara found herself driving toward the county courthouse where the auction was already gathering a modest crowd. Contractors, farmers, and local investors stood in small groups, studying printed property lists. Clara felt out of place in her faded jeans and worn sneakers. The auction moved quickly. Small parcels sold first. Several abandoned barns attracted surprisingly competitive bidding. Clara remained silent, clutching bitter paddle number 32. "Property 18, the auctioneer announced. "Former Ashgrove Telegraph Station. Minimum opening bid $75. Silence. The auctioneer looked around. Do I have 75? Clara slowly raised her paddle. A few heads turned. Someone chuckled. $75. The auctioneer paused. Any advance? Nobody answered. A man wearing a baseball cap laughed loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. She'll spend twice that chasing raccoons out, another added. Ruth won't survive another winter. More quiet laughter followed. Clara lowered her eyes but kept her paddle raised. Going once. The room remained silent. Going twice. Still nothing. Sold. $75. A few people shook their heads as Clara signed the paperwork. One older woman offered a sympathetic smile that somehow felt worse than the laughter. After paying nearly everything she owned, Clara counted the remaining bills. $6. The clerk slid a faded envelope across the counter. This came with the property records. Inside rested a heavy iron key darkened by age. Attached was a brittle tag reading simply, Telegraph Station. Only key we ever had, the clerk said. Good luck. She drove to the property just before sunset. Tall weeds surrounded the lonely building, and vines climbed its weathered walls. Broken windows reflected the orange sky, while an old telegraph pole still leaned beside the tracks that no longer existed. The place looked tired rather than dangerous, as though it had simply waited too long for someone to return. Clara climbed the porch steps carefully. Her new key resisted at first before finally turning with a loud, metallic click. The front door groaned open, releasing the scent of old wood, dust, and decades of silence. Sunlight spilled across cracked floorboards, an abandoned counter, and rusting telegraph equipment left exactly where someone had walked away long ago. She took one cautious step inside. Well, she whispered to the empty room, I guess we're both out of second chances. She smiled for the first time in weeks. It didn't last. At the far end of the station stood another door, smaller and built from thick oak, unlike the front entrance. It had no handle on the outside, only an old brass lock. Clara reached into her pocket and tried the iron key. It didn't fit. She checked every pocket of the envelope again. There was nothing else. Whatever waited behind that locked door had been sealed away with a different key. Morning light slipped through the cracked windows as Clara woke inside her hatchback, parked beside the abandoned telegraph station. She had spent the night there because $6 would not buy another motel room. Her neck ached from sleeping against the driver's seat, but the sight of the old building somehow gave her more comfort than the uncertainty waiting beyond it. It wasn't much, yet for the first time in weeks, she owned something that no bank or landlord could take away. After eating the last granola bar from her glove compartment, she unlocked the front door and stepped inside, carrying her grandfather's toolbox. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. The silence felt almost respectful, as if the building had grown accustomed to being ignored and wasn't quite sure what to make of a visitor. Clara walked slowly from room to room, taking stock of what remained. The main office still held a long wooden counter, polished smooth by hands from another century. Behind it stood a telegraph desk, its brass key tarnished but intact. A cracked glass battery jar rested on a shelf beside rusted coils of wire. Against one wall leaned a faded timetable for trains that had disappeared generations earlier. Most people would have seen junk. Clara saw history waiting to be understood. She brushed dirt from the telegraph key with an old paintbrush. "You deserved better," she murmured, smiling at herself for talking to an object. She knew almost nothing about telegraph equipment, but she remembered a grandfather explaining how operators once carried conversations across entire states with nothing more than electricity and patience. Every click had once meant news, hope, warnings, or heartbreak. That thought made the quiet room feel strangely alive. She spent the next 2 hours opening windows that still functioned, sweeping broken glass into small piles, and dragging fallen branches away from the porch. Practical work left little room for worry, and she welcomed that. Around midday, an old pickup truck rolled slowly onto the overgrown property. Clara straightened immediately, uncertain whether she was about to meet an angry neighbor. Instead, an elderly man climbed out wearing suspenders, a faded railroad cap, and a friendly expression hidden beneath a gray beard. "Thought I'd finally see who bought the place," he said. "Name's Walter Hayes." Clara introduced herself, brushing dust from her hands before shaking his. Walter glanced toward the station with familiar eyes. "Haven't been inside in years." "Did you work here?" she asked. He chuckled. "Too young for that. My father worked the railroad, though I spent half my childhood around these tracks." Clara invited him inside. Walter walked slowly through the office, gently touching the old counter as if greeting an old friend. "Amazing this equipment survived," he said, stopping beside the telegraph desk. "Most stations were stripped decades ago." "Was this place important?" Clara asked. Walter shook his head. "Not according to history. Ash Grove was a tiny stop. Supplies passed through. Messages came and went. Nothing famous ever happened here." His answer surprised her. The station looked too carefully built to have meant so little. Walter noticed her examining the walls. "What are you looking for?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "Something feels unfinished." He smiled kindly. "Old buildings do that. They make you think someone just stepped outside." Before leaving, Walter handed her a folded business card. "I'm retired. If you need local history or help identifying anything, stop by my house." "Thank you." "Take care of the old place." After his truck disappeared down the road, Clara returned inside. She studied the faded walls more carefully. While scraping away loose paint near the telegraph desk, her putty knife struck a slightly harder surface. Curious. She brushed away another layer of peeling paint. Faint marks emerged beneath it. Tiny dots and lines stretched across the wood in evenly spaced groups. At first, she thought they were scratches left by insects. Then she recognized the pattern. Morse code. Someone had deliberately carved the symbols before covering them with paint. She traced one sequence carefully with her fingertip. Whoever had hidden it had taken remarkable care to make it disappear. Clara copied the markings into a small notebook, although she couldn't read a single symbol. The discovery made Walter's comment echo in her mind. Nothing important ever happened here. Yet why would anyone hide Morse code inside an unimportant station? Before she could study the wall further, the sound of tires crunching over gravel interrupted her thoughts again. This time, a clean black SUV stopped outside. A well-dressed man stepped out carrying a leather folder. He smiled politely, but his eyes focused more on the building than on Clara. "You must be the new owner," he said. "Victor Lawson." Clara nodded cautiously. "Can I help you?" "Actually, I hope I can help you." He glanced around the neglected property. "I own several lots nearby. This old station sits in the middle of a redevelopment plan. I'd be happy to save you the trouble." "Trouble?" "Repairs, insurance, taxes." He offered a business card. "I'll buy the property from you today. Cash. Clara looked back at the building. Less than 24 hours earlier, everyone had laughed because she'd bought it. Now someone wanted it immediately. "I'm not interested," she replied. Victor's smile remained polite. "Think about it. You'd make an easy profit." "I just got here." "Fair enough." He tipped his head slightly before walking back to his SUV. "My offer won't disappear overnight." Clara watched him drive away until the road became quiet again. She folded his card and slipped it into her pocket without reading it. Something about the conversation unsettled her. If the station truly had so little value, why had he arrived so quickly? She returned and sighed, determined to continue cleaning rather than chasing questions she couldn't answer. Late that afternoon, she carried a bucket across the room when one floorboard shifted beneath her foot with a hollow thud unlike the others. She stopped immediately, setting the bucket aside. Clara knelt and pressed against the loose plank. It lifted just enough for her fingers to slide underneath. With careful effort, she pried it upward. Hidden beneath the floor rested a narrow metal tube sealed tightly at both ends. Clara carried the narrow metal tube to the telegraph desk before attempting to open it. Years of dust and corrosion had sealed the cap almost completely. She wrapped it in an old rag from her toolbox, gripped it with a pair of worn pliers, and twisted carefully. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp crack, the cap loosened. A faint smell of old paper escaped from inside. She tipped the tube gently, allowing several tightly rolled sheets to slide onto the desk. Her excitement faded almost immediately. Moisture had stained many of the papers beyond recognition. The edges crumbled when she touched them, and most of the ink had faded into pale brown shadows. Still, a few lines remained readable. They weren't letters. They were telegram forms. Clara unfolded the least damaged page beneath the sunlight coming through the window. The message itself was incomplete, but the heading remained clear enough to read, "United States Military Telegraph." Beneath it sat a date, October 1864. Another fragment carried a different date only weeks later. A third showed early 1865. Clara's heartbeat quickened. Walter had insisted nothing important had happened here during the Civil War, yet military telegrams had somehow been hidden beneath the station floor. She remembered the Morse code carved into the wall and looked back toward it. The two discoveries suddenly felt connected, even if she had no idea how. She photographed each fragile page with her phone before carefully placing them back into the tube. The nearest public library sat 20 minutes away in Ash Grove's small downtown. It wasn't large, but she hoped someone there could suggest how to preserve old documents. The librarian listened patiently before examining one of Clara's photographs. "You should speak with Nora Ellis," she said. "She manages the county archives across the street. If anyone can help, it's her." The county archives occupied a modest brick building that had once served as the courthouse records office. Shelves filled with neatly labeled boxes lined every wall. Behind a long wooden table sat a woman in her early 30s, wearing reading glasses and cotton gloves while sorting old maps. She looked up with a curious smile as Clara entered. "Can I help you?" Clara introduced herself and carefully explained where she had found the documents. Nora's expression changed immediately. "You found Civil War telegrams inside the telegraph station?" "I think so." "Let's have a look." Clara laid the photographs on the table instead of the originals. Nora seemed relieved by the decision. "Good," she said. "Old paper should stay where it's safest until we know how fragile it is." She enlarged one image on the computer screen, adjusting the contrast until faded writing became slightly clearer. Several missing words remained impossible to recover, but enough survived to raise questions. "These are authentic military forms. Nora said quietly. At least the paper appears to be. Can you read them? Only pieces. She pointed toward several surviving lines. Proceed immediately. Relay through Ashgrove. Delay unacceptable. She opened another image. This one references troop movement, but half the page is gone. Clara frowned. Walter told me the station wasn't important. Nora leaned back thoughtfully. Officially, Ashgrove wasn't considered a major military communications center. Officially, Nora smiled. History has a habit of becoming simpler than reality. She continued enhancing the images. More scattered words emerged. Regiment, dispatch, river crossing, emergency. None formed a complete story, yet together they suggested the station had handled military communications during critical months of the war. What's strange, Nora said, is that I don't remember seeing these messages in county records. She stood and retrieved a thick reference binder containing archived telegraph indexes. After several minutes of searching, she shook her hand. Nothing. Maybe they were lost, Clara suggested. Possible, or never filed. That answer lingered between them. Nora copied the visible text into her notebook. If you discover more documents, bring photographs first. We'll avoid unnecessary handling until we know how stable everything is. Clara thanked her and promised to return. As she reached the door, Nora added, Whatever happened at that station, don't assume every answer will be in official records. The afternoon sun hung low when Clara returned to the property. She unlocked the station and spread her notebook across the telegraph desk. Besides sketches of the carved Morse symbols, she copied the surviving words from the telegrams, hoping a pattern might emerge. Instead, she noticed something else. Several telegram forms carried tiny numbering marks in one corner. The numbers skipped unexpectedly. If these were part of a sequence, others were missing. She searched the room more carefully than before. Every cabinet drawer was empty except for rusted nails and broken glass. Shelves held only dust. Behind the counter, she tapped along the walls, listening for changes in sound. Most produced a solid knock. One section near the locked interior door answered with a dull, hollow echo. Clara paused. She measured the outside of the building by pacing along its walls before returning inside. The dimensions didn't quite match. Unless she had counted incorrectly, there should have been additional space somewhere beyond the interior wall. She checked again. The difference remained. You're hiding something, she whispered to the station itself. She examined the locked oak door once more. The old brass lock showed no signs of recent use, but the frame seemed unusually thick. She searched for hidden latches, loose boards, or removable panels, but found nothing. Frustrated, she stepped back and studied the room from a distance. The station's layout suddenly seemed oddly uneven, as though part of the original building had been closed off long ago. Evening settled quietly outside. Clara locked the front entrance before walking around the exterior one final time. Behind the station, near the rear foundation, she noticed several shallow scrape marks in the dirt where weeds had recently been disturbed. They weren't made by animals. Someone had cleared away vegetation there not long ago. Kneeling, she examined the ground more closely. A faint boot print remained pressed into the soft soil, fresher than anything left by decades of neglect. The mark pointed toward the back wall of the station before disappearing beneath fallen leaves. Clara slowly looked up at the weathered building. If someone else had searched here recently, they had been looking for the same hidden space she had just discovered might exist. Early the next morning, Clara stood behind the station studying the disturbed patch of ground once again. Overnight dew had settled across the weeds, but the scraped area remained obvious. Whoever had been there had cleared the vegetation recently, long after the station had been abandoned. She photographed the marks before returning inside. The uneven measurements from the previous evening still bothered her. She walked the building again, counting each careful step along the outside wall, then repeated the same path inside. The missing space was still there. It wasn't large, perhaps 6 or 7 feet, but it was enough to hide a narrow room. She rested her hand against the thick wall beside the locked oak door. "If there's another space," she whispered, "there has to be another way in." She tapped along the wooden panels with the handle of her screwdriver. Most produced the same solid sound she had heard before. Then, close to the floor beneath an old shelf, one section answered with a lower, hollow knock. Clara knelt immediately. The shelf had been nailed into the wall decades earlier. Its supports looked original, but one rusted screw had loosened over time. Using her grandfather's screwdriver, she slowly removed the remaining fasteners. The shelf resisted at first before pulling free, releasing a cloud of dust that sent her coughing into the morning air. Behind it, almost invisible beneath layers of paint, ran the outline of a narrow wooden panel. There was no handle, only a tiny recessed metal ring filled with dirt. Clara cleaned it with her pocket knife until her fingers could hook beneath it. She pulled gently. Nothing happened. She tried again, harder this time. The panel shifted with a groan, revealing a hidden opening just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. A rush of cool, stale air drifted from the darkness beyond. Clara switched on the flashlight from her toolbox and stepped carefully inside. The concealed room was smaller than she expected, but remarkably intact. Dust covered every surface, yet little appeared disturbed. Wooden shelves lined one wall. A narrow workbench occupied another. Unlike the front office, this room had no windows. It had been built to remain unseen. Her flashlight swept across objects that had sat untouched for generations. Several telegraph batteries rested on a shelf beside neatly coiled wire. A compact signal relay stood on a table beneath a canvas cover that had nearly rotted away. There were glass insulators, brass fittings, spare telegraph keys, and wooden storage boxes marked with faded military inventory numbers. Clara stared quietly, realizing she had entered a place few people had ever known existed. She resisted the urge to touch everything at once. Instead, she photographed the room from every angle before examining individual items. Most boxes contained ordinary maintenance supplies, but one drawer held neatly wrapped notebooks, pencils, and blank message forms. Time had yellowed the paper without destroying it. Whoever maintained this room had cared deeply about order. On the workbench sat a small leather pouch. Inside rested a silver pocket watch that had stopped at an unknown hour, along with a simple wedding band wrapped inside a folded handkerchief embroidered with the initials H.M. Clara carefully returned both items exactly as she had found them. Nearby lay a framed photograph beneath a layer of dust. She cleaned the glass with her sleeve. The faded image showed a young man standing beside a telegraph desk, wearing a Union telegraph operator's uniform. On the back, someone had written in careful handwriting, "Henry Mercer." The name meant nothing to Clara, yet seeing a face connected to the forgotten station somehow made the discovery feel personal. She remembered Walter saying no important history belonged here. That seemed harder to believe with every passing minute. Tucked beneath the photograph, she found several folded papers tied together with string. Unlike the damaged telegrams inside the metal tube, these had survived in much better condition. They appeared to be inventory records and supply receipts signed by Henry Mercer. One receipt listed replacement batteries delivered during the winter of 1864. Another documented telegraph wire repairs after storm damage. The station had clearly remained active far longer than local history suggested. Clara photographed each page before placing everything back exactly where it belonged, near the far corner of the hidden room. Her flashlight reflected off something pinned beneath a wooden box. She lifted the box carefully and discovered a folded map. The paper had become brittle with age but remained readable. It showed the rail lines surrounding Ash Grove and several nearby roads. Small pencil markings connected locations with short-coded notes she couldn't understand. One section near the station had been circled twice. She recognized none of the symbols. They didn't resemble ordinary handwriting. Folding the map carefully into a protective folder from her backpack, Clara decided it would be another document Nora might help interpret. Before leaving the hidden room, she paused for one last look. Nothing about it suggested panic or abandonment. Instead, it felt as though someone had intentionally hidden an organized workspace and expected it to remain undiscovered. She gently closed the concealed panel behind her. Outside, clouds had gathered while she worked, and distant thunder rolled across the hills. As she covered the hidden entrance with the old shelf again, the sound of another vehicle approached. Walter climbed from his pickup carrying a small paper bag. "Thought you might need lunch," he said with a smile. Clara accepted it gratefully. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." Figured anyone fixing this place probably wasn't eating properly. They sat together on the porch, sharing sandwiches while Clara carefully described what she had found, avoiding moving anything from its original place. Walter listened without interrupting. When she mentioned Henry Mercer's photograph, he frowned thoughtfully. "I've read a lot of local railroad history," he said. "That name doesn't sound familiar." "Neither did the military telegrams." Walter nodded slowly. "History sometimes remembers buildings better than people." Clara showed him the photograph on her phone and then the folded map. Walter adjusted his glasses while studying the image. "I don't recognize these markings," he admitted. "But whoever drew this knew the railway in remarkable detail." His attention shifted to one corner of the workbench, visible in another photograph. "Wait, what is it?" Clara zoomed in. Resting beside the map in the picture was the edge of a small notebook she had overlooked while documenting the room. She hurried back inside, reopened the concealed panel, and found the notebook exactly where the photograph suggested. It was thin, bound in dark leather, and covered with dust. Most pages were blank, except for a few containing dates and short maintenance notes written in careful script. The final written page held only one sentence. "The journal must never be found until the truth can be proved." Clara slowly turned the page, expecting more writing. The remaining sheets were empty. She looked back at the sentence again. The notebook did not explain what journal it meant or where it had been hidden. It only confirmed that somewhere beyond the hidden room, another record still waited to be discovered. The sentence stayed in Clara's thoughts long after Walter drove away. "The journal must never be found until the truth can be proved." Whoever had written those words hadn't described the journal as lost. They had described it as deliberately hidden. That distinction mattered. Before sunset, Clara photographed every page of the small notebook, then carefully returned it to the hidden room exactly where she had found it. She wanted every future discovery to remain beyond question. The next morning, she visited the county archives again. Nora looked up from a stack of land records and smiled. "You found something else?" Clara nodded and placed printed photographs across the table to the hidden room. Henry Mercer's portrait, the supply records, the railway map, and finally, the notebook page mentioning the journal. Nora studied each image without speaking. This changes things, she said quietly. Have you identified Henry Mercer yet? Clara shook her head. Nora moved to a filing cabinet labeled Civil War Personnel and began searching through several drawers. After nearly 20 minutes, she found a worn register listing Telegraph employees assigned throughout the region. Her finger stopped halfway down one page. Here. Clara leaned closer. Henry Mercer, telegraph operator, assigned to Ash Grove Station in August 1864. Relief crossed Clara's face. So he was real. Absolutely. Nora continued reading. Transferred from Nashville Division. Excellent service record. She paused. The final line was different from the rest. Status unknown following April 1865. Unknown? Clara asked. Nora nodded slowly. There's no discharge date, no death record attached, no reassignment. He simply disappeared. According to this file, yes. The answer raised more questions than it solved, but it fit the strange silence surrounding the station. Nora searched additional indexes while Clara examined old newspaper reels on a microfilm reader. After nearly an hour, she found a brief article dated May 1865. It mentioned several railroad employees returning home after the war. Henry Mercer's name was absent. Another newspaper from the following month referenced the reopening of nearby rail service, again without mentioning the station operator. Yet military payroll records still listed wages issued to Ash Grove through late April. Someone had continued working there almost until the war ended. These records don't agree, Clara said. Nora walked over. What did you find? Clara pointed toward the conflicting dates. Nora frowned. The payroll continues after local newspapers stopped mentioning the station. She compared the article with another county ledger. And according to this report, the station supposedly closed months earlier. Both can't be right. Exactly. They photographed the conflicting records for later comparison. Before Clara left, Nora carefully rolled out a large regional map. Show me where you found the hidden room. Clara indicated its location. Nora measured the wall thickness with her finger against the original station blueprint. The plans don't include that room at all. So it was added later? Or intentionally omitted? Clara folded the copied documents into her backpack. Every answer uncovered another inconsistency. But none changed the simple fact that Henry Mercer had existed and official records surrounding him were incomplete. On her way back to the station, she stopped at Walter's small farmhouse. He welcomed her inside, where shelves overflowed with railroad books, local photographs, and neatly labeled binders collected over decades. Clara showed him the payroll records and newspaper copies. Walter adjusted his glasses and compared the dates. These don't match because someone relied on different sources. He reached for another binder filled with handwritten notes from retired railroad workers he had interviewed years earlier. Most discussed train schedules, weather, or station repairs. One elderly conductor had briefly mentioned Ash Grove. Walter read aloud. Operator stayed longer than anyone expected. Quiet fellow, always working. No name, Clara asked. Walter shook his head. Just the operator. He searched another folder. Nothing. I've spent 40 years collecting local history, he admitted. It's remarkable how little anyone remembered about this station. Clara hesitated before asking, Do you think that happened by accident? Walter answered honestly, I don't know. Sometimes people are forgotten because history moves too quickly. Sometimes records simply disappear. As Clara prepared to leave, Walter handed her a photocopy of an old railroad maintenance log. Maybe this helps. Back at the station, she compared the maintenance log with the inventory records found inside the hidden room. Several signatures matched Henry Mercer's careful handwriting. The dates aligned perfectly. Whoever had organized the hidden workspace had also maintained the station until nearly the end of the war. Late that afternoon, Clara decided to inspect every drawer and storage box again, paying closer attention to anything bearing Henry's name. Most contained practical supplies exactly where she had left them. Then, inside a shallow wooden drawer beneath the workbench, she noticed several folded envelopes tucked behind a loose divider. Their paper had yellowed but remained intact. Each envelope carried no mailing address, only a date and the initials H.M. Inside were handwritten letters. None appeared to have been sent. Clara read the first carefully. It came from a Union soldier recovering after a difficult campaign. "I cannot thank you by name," one passage read, "but because of the message you chose to send when you did, families reached safety before the fighting arrived." Clara frowned. She opened another letter. This one thanked an unnamed telegraph operator for placing humanity before orders. A third described children escaping ahead of advancing troops after receiving unexpected warning. None explained exactly what Henry had done. None identified the military action involved. Yet every letter expressed gratitude instead of accusation. Clara photographed each page before returning them to their envelopes. Whatever Henry Mercer had accomplished, soldiers remembered it with respect, even if official history did not. She sat quietly at the old telegraph desk as evening shadows filled the station. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt patient. Piece by piece, its story was choosing to reveal itself before locking the hidden room. Clara noticed one final envelope wedged beneath the back corner of the drawer. It contained only a single folded sheet. Unlike the others, this message was not a letter of thanks. It consisted of one handwritten sentence. "If the journal is ever needed, look beneath the place where every message began." The unsigned note stayed on Clara's desk until dawn. "If the journal is ever needed, look beneath the place where every message began." She read the sentence several more times before walking to the original telegraph desk in the front office. Every message that had passed through the station would have begun there. With the operator seated before the brass telegraph key, she carefully brushed away another layer of dust and examined the heavy wooden desk from every angle. It had survived more than a century, scarred by use but remarkably solid. The brass key remained bolted to the surface exactly where Henry Mercer had once worked. Clara resisted the temptation to pry at random. If someone had hidden something here, damaging the desk would destroy part of the station's history. Instead, she photographed every inch before studying its construction. The desktop appeared original, but the support frame underneath had been reinforced at some point with newer screws than the hand-forged nails elsewhere in the building. She lay on the floor with a flashlight and noticed faint markings carved into one of the underside beams. They matched the same pattern of dots and dashes she had found beneath the peeling paint. Rather than guessing, she photographed the symbols and drove straight to the county archives. Nora spread the printed photographs across a large table. "More Morse code," she said with growing excitement. "This time, there's enough to translate." She pulled a reference chart from a shelf and began matching the carved symbols one group at a time. Clara watched silently, trying not to interrupt. Nora spoke each completed word aloud. "Lift the signal." She paused to verify the final sequence. "Frame." Clara looked back at the photograph of the telegraph desk. "The signal frame." Nora nodded. "That would make sense. The telegraph key sits on a wooden mounting frame." Clara smiled for the first time that morning. So the message wasn't pointing to the room, it was pointing to the desk itself. Before she left, Nora asked to compare the recently discovered documents with several state archive copies stored on microfilm. While Clara waited, Nora returned carrying 2 folders. There's something odd. She placed identical military communication summaries side by side. At first glance, they appeared the same, but several lines differed. One version listed relay stations including Ashgrove. The other omitted it completely. Different editions? Clara asked. Nora shook her head. They're both supposed to be official copies. She pointed to a section where a station identification number had clearly been erased and rewritten in one document. Someone altered this after it was created. Clara studied the pages carefully. Would that happen accidentally? Not like this. Nora turned another page. More corrections appeared. Dates had been changed. Routing notes had disappeared. References to Ashgrove became fewer with each revision. These records weren't simply lost, Nora said quietly. Somebody edited them. Neither woman rushed to draw conclusions. They simply documented every difference with photographs. Clara left carrying copies of the altered records, careful not to speculate beyond what the evidence showed. Back at the station, she crawled beneath the telegraph desk with a screwdriver and flashlight. The mounting frame supporting the brass key had indeed been attached separately from the rest of the desk. Removing the first few screws took patience, their threads stiff with rust. Eventually, the wooden frame lifted free. Nothing appeared underneath except dust and worn boards. Clara sighed, wondering if she had misunderstood the message. Then she noticed that the mounting platform itself felt heavier than expected. She turned it over. Along one edge, a narrow wooden strip had been fitted so precisely it almost disappeared. Using the tip of her pocket knife, she gently eased the strip loose. Inside lay a shallow hidden compartment, no wider than her hand. It contained only 3 folded papers. The first was a tiny sketch, showing the concealed room she had already discovered. The second listed maintenance dates in Henry Mercer's handwriting. The third was different. It carried no title, only a single paragraph written carefully in dark ink. If this is found, history can finally be corrected. Trust only what can be proven. The journal alone carries the full account. Clara sat quietly for several moments before reading it again. Henry, or someone close to him, had expected future readers to demand evidence rather than stories. That realization somehow made the hidden message feel even more honest. She photographed the papers before sealing them inside archival sleeves she had purchased from the library. As the afternoon passed, Clara organized every discovery across the old counter. Photographs of the hidden room, copies of the military telegrams, Henry's supply records, the letters from grateful soldiers, the altered government reports, and the newest note from beneath the telegraph key. One pattern had become unmistakable. Every clue pointed toward the missing journal without replacing it. The journal remained the only document capable of explaining everything. Near sunset, a county vehicle slowed beside the property. An official stepped out carrying an envelope. "Delivery for Clara Bennett." She signed for it and waited until the vehicle disappeared before opening the notice. The letter explained that a preliminary structural review had been requested for the abandoned station following redevelopment inquiries in the surrounding area. No immediate action was required, but an inspection could determine whether the building remained safe for occupancy. Clara folded the notice carefully. She knew exactly who had offered to purchase the property only days earlier. She refused to let frustration distract her. Instead, she placed the letter beside her growing collection of documents and returned to the hidden room one more time before nightfall. Standing quietly among Henry Mercer's carefully preserved tools, she examined the walls with fresh attention. If he had hidden messages beneath paint and inside furniture, perhaps the building itself still held another clue. Her flashlight drifted across the old support beams overhead. One beam carried faint carved dots and dashes, almost invisible beneath years of dust. She climbed onto the workbench for a closer look and carefully brushed the surface clean. The symbols were weathered but readable enough for Nora's chart. Clara copied them into her notebook before translating them herself letter by letter. It took nearly 20 minutes, but the sentence gradually appeared, "If this is found, history can finally be corrected." She smiled faintly as she realized Henry had repeated the same message in 2 different places, making certain that whoever searched honestly would never lose hope. Yet beneath that sentence, almost hidden inside the final line of carving, rested one additional group of symbols she had not noticed before. After translating the last sequence, Clara's smile disappeared. It read simply, "The records were changed." The final carved message stayed with Clara throughout the night. The records were changed. It was no longer only a suspicion suggested by conflicting documents. Someone from Henry Mercer's own time had believed official records no longer reflected the truth. Even so, Clara reminded herself that belief alone was not proof. Henry himself had written that only evidence mattered. The missing journal remained the one piece still absent. The following morning, she spread the railway map across the counter once again. She studied the faded pencil markings more carefully than before. Most of the coded symbols remained beyond her understanding, but one detail finally caught her attention. The circled location near the station sat beside a narrow maintenance trail that no longer appeared on modern maps. Curious. She compared the old map with a recent county survey she had copied from the archives. Although the trail had vanished decades earlier, the land itself still existed beyond a line of overgrown trees behind the station. Clara folded both maps into her backpack, grabbed a shovel from her grandfather's toolbox, and followed the forgotten route. Nature had reclaimed most of the path. Thick brush and fallen branches slowed every step. Several times, she stopped to compare landmarks with the faded map until an unusually level clearing appeared ahead. Moss-covered stones formed the outline of what had once been a small storage platform beside the railway. Most of the wooden structure had long since disappeared. Only fragments remained beneath layers of leaves. Clara searched carefully without disturbing more ground than necessary. The map's markings pointed toward the far corner of the clearing, where the earth dipped slightly beside the remains of an old post. She pushed away loose soil with her shovel. A dull, metallic sound answered almost immediately. Kneeling, she cleared the remaining dirt by hand. Buried just beneath the surface rested a weathered iron storage box no larger than a toolbox. Its hinges had rusted badly, but the lid remained intact. Carrying it carefully back to the station, Clara pried it open with slow, even pressure to avoid damaging whatever remained inside. Instead of valuables, she found neatly stacked military supply records wrapped inside oilcloth. Several brass telegraph fittings rested beneath the papers, still protected from moisture after all those years. At first, the discovery felt disappointing. There was no journal. But as she unfolded the preserved documents, she realized their importance almost immediately. The supply records listed emergency shipments delivered to Ashgrove during the final months of the Civil War. Henry Mercer's signature appeared repeatedly beside each delivery. More surprising were handwritten notes attached to several entries documenting food, blankets, and medical supplies redirected toward nearby civilian settlements rather than military camps. Clara photographed every page before sealing them inside protective sleeves. These records did not explain why the changes had been made, but they confirmed that Henry had overseen movements extending beyond ordinary railway maintenance. She carried copies to Walter that afternoon. He read each page carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful with every document. Most local histories describe this station as little more than a relay office, he said quietly. These records suggest something much larger. Clara pointed toward one shipment marked with an unfamiliar code. Can you tell where these supplies went? Walter retrieved an old railroad map from one of his shelves. Together they matched several route numbers to abandoned settlements surrounding Ash Grove. These weren't military forts, Walter realized. They were farming communities. Clara remembered the letters thanking Henry for helping families reach safety. The evidence no longer stood alone. Different documents from different sources pointed toward the same pattern. Henry Mercer had somehow directed aid toward civilians. Walter leaned back in his chair. If these records are genuine, someone preserved the practical evidence while hiding the explanation. Clara nodded. The explanation is probably still in the journal. Walter smiled faintly. Then you've come farther than anyone before you. On her drive back to the station, Clara noticed fresh tire tracks leading toward the property. They hadn't been there that morning. Her pace quickened. The front door stood exactly as she had locked it, but footprints crossed the weeds behind the building near the disturbed ground she had examined days earlier. She immediately checked the hidden room. Everything remained in place. Nothing appeared stolen. Still, someone had clearly entered the property while she was gone. As she stepped back outside, another vehicle approached along the gravel road. This time it belonged to the county sheriff's office. A deputy climbed out, introducing himself as Ethan Cole. "Afternoon," he said politely. "We received a report about possible trespassing out here." Clara glanced toward the fresh footprints. "I think someone was here today." Ethan examined the ground carefully. "Looks recent." He followed the tracks around the building before stopping near the rear wall. "Hard to identify anyone from this, but you're right. These weren't made yesterday." Clara explained that she had recently purchased the station and had already discovered signs someone had searched the property before. She avoided mentioning the concealed room or specific documents until she understood more. Ethan listened without dismissing her concerns. "If anyone returns without permission," he said, "call us immediately. Even abandoned places belong to someone." Before leaving, he handed her his card. "This building means something to you?" he asked. Clara looked back at the weathered station. "More every day." Ethan nodded. "Then let's keep it that way." As evening settled over Ash Grove, Clara returned to organizing the newly discovered supply records, together with the military telegrams, the letters from soldiers, and the altered government reports. They painted an increasingly consistent picture. Henry Mercer had not been preserving military advantage. He had been preserving lives. Yet every document stopped just short of explaining why his actions had disappeared from history. The journal remained the only missing piece. Long after sunset, Clara reopened the weathered railway map under a brighter lantern. She examined every fold, every penciled mark, every edge. Something felt different about its thickness. Holding it toward the light, she noticed an unusually stiff corner that had escaped her attention before. With careful fingers, she separated two layers of paper that had been glued together decades earlier. Hidden inside was a tiny folded note, no larger than a matchbook. She unfolded it carefully. It contained only 7 handwritten words. "The journal is not here. Search the station." The tiny note hidden inside the railway map changed Clara's entire approach. "The journal is not here. Search the station." She read the 7 words several times before carefully returning the note to its protective sleeve. Every clue she had followed beyond the building had produced valuable evidence, but none had led to the missing journal. Whoever had hidden it had expected future searchers to waste time looking elsewhere. Henry, or the person protecting his work, had quietly redirected anyone paying close attention back to the one place everyone assumed had already surrendered its secrets. Early the next morning, Clara unlocked the station before sunrise. She stood silently in the center of the main office, studying every wall, every beam, and every piece of furniture she had already examined more than once. She resisted the urge to begin tearing things apart. Henry Mercer had hidden every previous clue with remarkable care, never requiring destruction to uncover it. The journal would likely be protected the same way. She retrieved the original station blueprint Nora had copied from the county archives and spread it across the counter beside her own sketches of the concealed room. Although the hidden room had never appeared on the official plans, the remaining measurements matched the building closely. Clara compared every doorway, every window, and every support wall until one detail finally stood out. The blueprint showed an unusually thick interior wall between the public office and the former waiting area. At first, she dismissed it as structural reinforcement. Then she realized the hidden room had already explained one unusual wall. Could there be another concealed space built into the same section? She measured the distance carefully with a tape measure from her grandfather's toolbox. Once again, the numbers failed to align perfectly. The difference was much smaller than before, barely enough to hide a narrow compartment. But it existed. Clara examined the wall inch by inch. Unlike the hidden entrance she had already discovered, no outline appeared beneath the paint. She tapped every board gently with the wooden handle of a screwdriver. Most answered with the familiar solid sound of old pine. One section beside the waiting bench sounded only slightly different, not hollow but muted. She removed the bench from the wall, revealing years of untouched dust. Nothing else appeared unusual until sunlight reached the bare boards at a different angle. Faint tool marks crossed one vertical plank. They were almost invisible beneath old varnish. Kneeling, Clara brushed the surface gently. The plank carried no nails. Instead, tiny wooden pegs held it in place. She carefully loosened the first peg with the point of her knife, then the second. The board refused to move until she pressed lightly against its lower edge. It shifted inward less than an inch before swinging aside like a narrow door. Behind it rested a cavity built directly into the wall. Clara held her breath. The compartment was only a few inches deep, just large enough to conceal a long wooden box wrapped in faded oilcloth. She lifted it carefully into the sunlight. Unlike every other object she had discovered, this box had been crafted with unusual precision. The lid fit perfectly against its sides, and traces of old wax still sealed the edges against moisture. There was no lock, only a small handwritten label attached beneath the string. It read simply, "For the truth." Clara placed the box on the telegraph desk without opening it. Instead, she photographed the compartment, the box, the wrapping, and the label from every angle. She called Walter first. He arrived within half an hour, followed shortly afterward by Nora carrying archival gloves and preservation materials. Neither spoke much after seeing the sealed box. Walter removed his hat quietly. Looks like it's been waiting a long time. Nora nodded. Let's make sure we disturb as little as possible. Wearing gloves, she carefully cut the brittle string and peeled away the remaining oilcloth. The wooden lid lifted with almost no resistance. Inside rested a single leather-bound journal protected beneath folded linen. The leather had darkened with age, but it remained remarkably well preserved. No money, no jewels, no hidden deeds. Just the journal. Clara stared at it without reaching inside. After weeks of searching, the object that had quietly connected every clue was finally real. Nora gently lifted the journal from the box. Beneath it lay one additional folded sheet explaining how the journal had been wrapped in waxed cloth to survive damp conditions. No other items remained inside. Walter looked toward Clara. I think you found what Henry wanted people to find. Clara nodded slowly, unable to look away from the worn cover. Embossed across the front in fading gold letters were two simple words: Henry Mercer. No subtitle, no decoration, just a name nearly forgotten by history. They examined the outside carefully before opening it. The binding remained strong despite its age. Several loose slips of paper rested between later pages, but Nora left them untouched for the moment. Everything should stay in order, she said softly. Photograph each page before we turn it. Clara agreed immediately. They spent the next hour documenting the journal exactly as they had documented every earlier discovery. Every photograph captured its condition before a single page moved. When the process was complete, the room fell quiet again. Walter stepped back respectfully. Go ahead, he said. Clara rested one gloved hand against the cover. Weeks earlier, she had arrived in Ash Grove with $6, no future, and a building everyone believed was worthless. Now she sat inside that forgotten station, holding the one document every hidden message had protected for more than a century and a half. She slowly lifted the front cover. The first page revealed Henry Mercer's careful handwriting, still dark and remarkably clear despite the passing years. Clara's eyes moved to the opening sentence, but before reading any further, she gently closed the journal again. The time for searching was over. The time for understanding had finally begun. Clara returned to the station before sunrise with Nora and Walter, determined to read the journal slowly rather than rushing toward conclusions. Every page had already been photographed, and the original rested on a padded support to protect its fragile binding. The first line explained why Henry Mercer had written it at all. If these pages are ever opened, let them stand above rumor, memory, or pride. Let only the truth remain. Clara paused after reading the sentence aloud. It sounded remarkably similar to the messages hidden throughout the station. Henry had never asked to be believed without evidence. He had expected every claim to be tested. The opening chapters of the journal described ordinary days as a telegraph operator. Henry recorded train schedules, equipment repairs, and weather reports with careful precision. His entries revealed a disciplined man who believed every message carried responsibility because lives depended on accuracy. Walter smiled quietly. That matches everything we found. Clara continued reading. As the Civil War intensified, the journal shifted. Military dispatches became more frequent. Telegraph lines carried urgent reports day and night. Henry wrote that information often reached him before soldiers themselves appeared along the railway. Entire communities waited unknowingly while distant commanders made decisions that would soon reshape their lives. Several pages later, Henry described receiving two conflicting telegraph messages on the same evening. One ordered military units toward a strategic crossing. The other contained reports that families from nearby farming settlements remained trapped between advancing forces. Henry admitted he realized the official dispatches focused entirely on troop movement while ignoring civilians who had no warning. Clara looked up from the page. No one in the room spoke. The next entries explained the difficult choice that followed. Henry quietly delayed one military transmission for only a short time while sending warning messages through local railway operators and trusted station agents to communities along the route. The delay measured minutes rather than hours, yet those minutes allowed wagons carrying children, elderly residents, and supplies to leave before fighting reached the area. Henry never claimed to have stopped a battle. He simply wrote that innocent families deserved enough time to escape. Clara remembered the letters thanking an unnamed operator for placing humanity before orders. Suddenly, every sentence fit. Walter removed his glasses, his eyes fixed on the journal. He wasn't protecting an army, he whispered. He was protecting people. Nora nodded, but continued reading carefully. Henry admitted he understood the consequences. Altering communication procedures even briefly could end his career. Yet he wrote that he could not convince himself that strict obedience mattered more than civilian lives. One passage stayed with Clara more than any other. If history remembers me poorly, let the families remember differently. That will be enough. The journal continued through the final weeks of the war. Henry documented delivering food, blankets, and medical supplies using ordinary railway shipments whenever possible. The supply records Clara had discovered beneath the old platform matched the journal exactly. Dates, signatures, and destinations aligned without contradiction. Toward the end, Henry described growing concern that official reports no longer reflected what had actually happened. He wrote that certain communication logs had been copied, edited, and redistributed. Rather than accusing individuals by name, he simply listed original message numbers beside corrected versions. Nora compared them with the altered archive copies they had already photographed. Every sequence matched. The evidence supported itself. The final completed entry explained Henry's decision to disappear from public records. He believed defending himself publicly would force military officials to deny civilian warnings had ever occurred. Instead, he gathered supporting documents, sealed them inside the station, and entrusted the journal to remain hidden until enough independent evidence survived to confirm the story honestly. Clara turned the final written page. No dramatic confession followed, no hidden fortune, no revenge, only a quiet, closing sentence. May those who find this care more for truth than for my name. The room remained silent for several moments. Walter finally spoke. He never asked to be called a hero. Nora nodded. Only to be understood. Clara closed the journal gently. Every discovery over the past weeks, the telegrams, the supply records, the hidden room, the letters from grateful soldiers, the altered reports, the carved Morse messages, had pointed toward exactly this moment. None of the evidence stood alone. Together, they formed one consistent account. That afternoon, the three of them organized every document into chronological order. Nora prepared comparison charts showing the original and altered records side by side. Walter contributed historical context drawn from railroad documents and regional maps. Clara labeled every photograph, ensuring each item could be traced back to its original location inside the station. Nothing depended upon memory alone. By evening, several tables inside the old station held neatly arranged evidence ready for professional review. Clara looked around the room that had once seemed abandoned beyond saving. Now, every surface carried part of a forgotten history, patiently waiting to be examined. Deputy Ethan Cole stopped by briefly after receiving Clara's message that important historical documents had been recovered. She showed him the organized materials without making exaggerated claims. Ethan studied the journal respectfully before looking around the restored workspace. "Looks like you've done this the right way," he said. "We're trying," Clara replied. Ethan nodded. "Then let the evidence speak." After he left, Clara stepped outside as the sun settled behind the old telegraph poles. Weeks earlier, she had arrived believing the station might simply become a roof over her head. Instead, it had given her responsibilities she had never expected. Tomorrow, historians and county officials would review everything they had assembled. Whether Henry Mercer's story finally returned to the historical record would depend not on emotion, but on the evidence carefully waiting inside. The following morning, the quiet telegraph station welcomed more visitors than it had seen in generations. Historians from the County Historical Society arrived first, followed by archivists, preservation specialists, and local officials. Nora greeted each of them with organized folders containing photographs, document inventories, and comparison charts. Walter stood nearby, answering questions about regional railroad history while carefully distinguishing documented facts from personal opinion. Clara remained by the telegraph desk, where the journal rested inside a protective display cradle. She had spent the previous evening worrying that someone would dismiss everything as coincidence. But once the review began, the evidence spoke with remarkable consistency. Every artifact had been photographed where it was discovered. Every telegram matched surviving military forms. Henry Mercer's handwriting appeared across supply records, maintenance logs, and the journal itself. The altered communication reports aligned with the original message numbers Henry had carefully recorded. Nothing depended upon a single dramatic discovery. Instead, dozens of independent pieces reinforced one another. The lead archivist spent nearly an hour examining the journal's paper, ink, and binding before quietly closing the cover. "The preservation methods alone explain why it survived," he said. Another specialist compared the military telegrams to authenticated government documents from the same period. The printing styles matched. Watermarks corresponded to suppliers used during the Civil War. Even the damaged telegram fragments recovered from the metal tube fit naturally into the communication sequence documented inside Henry's journal. By early afternoon, the discussion shifted from authenticity to historical significance. One county commissioner looked toward Clara. "Without this station remaining intact, none of these records would have survived." Clara glanced around the room before answering. "The station protected them long before I arrived." Walter smiled quietly at those words. Weeks earlier, he had told Clara that old buildings remembered. Standing inside the restored office, he looked as though he had just watched one finally speak again. News of the discovery spread quickly through Ash Grove. Neighbors who had laughed at the $75 purchase now stopped outside the station asking respectful questions. Some brought old family photographs hoping they might contribute additional history. Others simply thanked Clara for refusing to abandon the building when selling it would have been easier. Even those who admitted they had doubted her seemed genuinely pleased that the forgotten station had finally revealed its story. Victor Lawson returned only once after the official review concluded. He listened politely as county representatives explained that preservation proceedings had begun immediately. Because of the newly authenticated Civil War records and the exceptional historical integrity of the building, demolition or redevelopment would no longer be considered. Victor accepted the decision without argument. His business proposal quietly ended where the historical evidence began. Within weeks, volunteers gathered almost every weekend to stabilize the aging structure. Local carpenters repaired the porch using lumber that matched the original design. Broken windows were replaced with historically appropriate glass. The leaking roof received careful restoration instead of modern replacement. College students studying preservation helped catalog every recovered artifact, while Nora supervised archival storage for the most fragile documents. Walter became an unofficial guide, happily sharing railway history with anyone willing to listen. Deputy Ethan Cole occasionally stopped by during his patrols, pleased to see visitors treating the property with respect rather than curiosity alone. Clara worked alongside everyone else, sanding wood, organizing exhibits, and learning skills she had never imagined needing when she had arrived with $6 in her pocket. The building slowly changed, yet its character remained untouched. The concealed room stayed preserved exactly as it had been discovered, allowing future visitors to understand how carefully Henry Mercer had protected the truth. The telegraph desk remained in its original position, its hidden compartment now empty except for a small display explaining how it had once safeguarded essential evidence. Months later, the county formally recognized the Ash Grove Telegraph Station as a protected historical landmark. During the dedication ceremony, historians presented the findings publicly. They explained that Henry Mercer had not been erased because his actions lacked importance. Instead, the surviving evidence showed that his role had gradually disappeared, as records were altered and simplified after the war. His journal, supported by independent documents hidden throughout the station, restored that missing chapter with remarkable clarity. No one described him as a perfect man. The presentation acknowledged the difficult decisions he had faced and the risks he had knowingly accepted. What mattered was not legend, but evidence. Henry Mercer had delayed communication briefly to give vulnerable families enough time to escape approaching violence. He had redirected available supplies towards civilians when possible. He had documented everything carefully, expecting future generations to verify his account rather than simply believe it. That commitment to truth impressed the audience as much as the actions themselves. Near the entrance, a bronze plaque was installed beside the original telegraph key. It did not celebrate treasure or mystery. It read, "In honor of Henry Mercer, telegraph operator, whose careful record preserved the truth and whose compassion protected lives." Clara stood quietly at the back of the crowd while people read the inscription. She never stepped forward to claim attention. She knew she had not created Henry's legacy. She had only uncovered it. After the ceremony, Walter joined her on the restored porch. "Your grandfather would have liked this place," he said. Clara smiled. "He always said buildings remember." Walter looked toward the station. Turns out he was right. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm. Clara transformed part of the station into a small museum where school groups, railroad enthusiasts, and local families could explore the history of telegraph communication and the carefully documented story of Henry Mercer. Nora continued assisting with research, occasionally discovering additional records that confirmed details already found in the journal. Ethan remained a familiar visitor, usually arriving with a friendly wave rather than official business. The museum never became famous, but it became meaningful. Visitors left, understanding that history was often preserved not by grand monuments, but by ordinary people willing to protect the truth. One quiet autumn morning, nearly a year after the auction, Clara unlocked the front door before the first visitors arrived. Sunlight crossed the polished floorboards where dust had once gathered undisturbed. The telegraph equipment rested exactly where it had stood generations earlier, now carefully conserved instead of forgotten. Inside a climate-controlled display case near the original operator's desk lay Henry Mercer's journal, open to its first page beneath protective glass. Beside it rested the heavy iron key that had first unlocked the station for Clara. She paused before the exhibit, remembering the frightened young woman who had counted $81 in a motel parking lot, spent 75 of them on a building everyone else had dismissed, and wondered whether she had just ruined the last chance she had left. The purchase had never made her wealthy. It had given her something far more lasting. It had given her purpose, a community, and the privilege of returning an honorable man to the place history had almost forgotten. As the first visitors stepped through the restored doorway, Clara welcomed them with a warm smile. Behind her, the old telegraph station no longer stood as an abandoned relic waiting to collapse. It stood exactly as Henry Mercer had hoped it someday would. A place where the truth, patiently protected through generations of silence, could finally be heard. Final reveal. The greatest surprise was never hidden beneath the floorboards or inside a forgotten wall. It was hidden inside a man's character for generations. Henry Mercer had been remembered by no one because history had quietly erased him. His name vanished from official records. His telegraph station was abandoned, and the truth about his final months disappeared with him. Yet he never hid his journal to protect himself. He hid it to protect the truth, until enough evidence existed to prove it honestly. The journal revealed that during the final months of the Civil War, Henry made an impossible choice. Faced with military orders and the knowledge that innocent families stood directly in the path of advancing armies, he delayed a critical dispatch by only a few minutes. Just long enough to send warnings through trusted railway operators. Those precious minutes allowed hundreds of civilians to flee before violence reached their homes. Henry knew exactly what the decision would cost him. Rather than defend himself or seek recognition after the war, he quietly gathered every piece of supporting evidence, concealed them throughout the telegraph station, and disappeared from public history. He believed that if people ever discovered his story, they should believe the documents, not the man. More than 150 years later, Clara Bennett unknowingly became the final link in that plan. She had not inherited the station. She had not been chosen by fate. She simply refused to walk away from something everyone else believed was worthless. By purchasing an abandoned telegraph station for $75, she restored not only a forgotten building, but also the reputation of a man whose greatest legacy was compassion rather than fame. In the end, the real treasure was never gold, land, or hidden wealth. It was the restoration of truth. And sometimes, that is the rarest inheritance anyone can receive. Lessons learned. Never judge the value of something solely by its appearance. What the world calls worthless may carry extraordinary meaning. True courage is often quiet. The people who change history are not always the ones remembered by history. Evidence is stronger than opinion. Henry preserved facts, not legends, trusting that the truth could one day stand on its own. Compassion sometimes demands difficult choices. Doing what is right is not always the same as doing what is easy. The past is never truly gone, while someone is willing to preserve it with honesty and care. Failure can become the beginning of a better life. Clara believed she had lost everything, yet her lowest moment led her to discover her greatest purpose. A meaningful legacy is measured not by wealth or recognition, but by the lives we improve and the truth we leave behind. Sometimes the smallest decision, a $75 purchase that everyone laughed at, can become the moment that changes not only one life, but restores justice to another across generations.